The air was thick and cold, smelling of damp earth and diesel exhaust. The only sound was the low, rattling idle of a car engine and the rhythmic shush thump of distant, heavily armed border patrols moving through the dense pine forest. Sergeant Klaus Richter, a veteran Hauptfeldwebel of the Nationale Volksarmee, NVA, adjusted the collar of his heavy greatcoat and spat a thin stream of phlegm into the dirt. His breath plumed white in the harsh beam of the searchlight mounted atop the nearest Grenzturm, the watchtower that loomed over the first coil of barbed wire. Klaus and his two subordinates, young Private Dieter Muller and Corporal Volker Voss, were completing their pre-dawn inspection of Sperrgebiet A, the high-security zone paralleling the inner German border, less than 200 meters from the west. They were bored, they were cold, and they were tired of the oppressive, suffocating silence that was the hallmark of the Iron Curtain. The border was quiet, too quiet. The constant, gnawing fear of an escape attempt, a phantom menace that justified their endless patrols, was always present, but lately, the attempts had been few and pathetically inept. A desperate swimmer in the Baltic, a failed tunneling effort near Berlin, and last week, a teenager caught trying to climb the double fence near Eisenach with nothing but a pair of gardening gloves. Klaus squinted at the car parked conspicuously by the overgrown tree line, about 50 meters from their position. It was a dark, boxy, ridiculously tiny sedan, a Wartburg 311. It was a common sight, a tired working-class machine, but this one looked odd. It had been crudely stripped, almost aggressively customized. The rear seat was gone, replaced by what looked like a bizarre array of metal tubing and hastily welded plates. The original roof rack was still there, but now it held several large, gleaming, cylindrical tanks, the kind used for compressed industrial gas. "Look at that heap of junk, Richter," Corporal Voss chuckled, bringing his Kalashnikov up to rest on his hip. "Some poor idiot had an engine stall right by the anti-tank ditch. That'll be a nice tow job for the political police." Private Muller, nervously clutching his rifle, whispered, "Or maybe it's an attempt, Sergeant. It looks modified." Klaus grunted, pulling a pair of worn Zeiss binoculars from his breast pocket. He trained them on the car. The driver's door was slightly ajar. The vehicle sat just beyond the last patrol road, right before the death strip, a cleared, raked area of sand designed to register the footprints of any would-be defector. The barbed wire fence, the first of 3 obstacles, was maybe 15 meters from the car's front bumper. "Modified?" "Yes, Muller," Klaus said, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. "It looks like he's trying to soup up his grocery getter. Look at the back. Is that 2 drain pipes? Welded to the bumper." Voss and Muller stepped closer, trying to see what Klaus saw. The drain pipes were 2 short, wide, black metal funnels, crude jet nozzles, amateurishly bolted to the car's rear chassis. They pointed slightly upward. It was a bizarre, almost comical sight, a monument to misguided mechanical ambition. "He's making a rocket car, Voss." Klaus laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "A rocket to escape East Germany. Hans Strelczyk here thinks he's a test pilot." "What an idiot," Voss agreed, shaking his head. "He must think we're going to be impressed by his engineering. Should we radio it in, Sergeant?" Klaus lowered the binoculars, his eyes now narrowed, no longer amused. The back window of the Wartburg had been replaced by a heavy sheet of metal. There was a faint metallic smell that wasn't diesel, something cleaner, sharper, and there was movement inside the cabin. A dark shape hunched low over the steering wheel. "No, not yet," Klaus ordered, his voice suddenly sharp. "Let's observe. He's right on the edge of the zone. Let's see what this lunatic does with his DDR hot rod. Maybe he's just starting a very, very early morning drive to work." The 3 soldiers watched, their laughter now completely gone, replaced by a sudden, electric tension. The car's idling engine sputtered, then roared, an angry, strained sound. A man's face, pale and intensely focused, briefly flashed in the windshield as he adjusted something on the dashboard. He was Hans Strelczyk, a 43-year-old master mechanic from Posneck, who had spent the last 2 years hoarding parts, scavenging for tanks, and sacrificing his sleep and sanity for this one impossible moment. His wife and 2 children were already hidden under thick woolen blankets on the stripped-out back floor, packed tight in the dark, cavernous space where the rear seat used to be. The children were quiet, their mother, Ingrid, having drugged them lightly with an old cough syrup to ensure their silence. Strelczyk took a deep, shuddering breath. His plan was insane, he knew. It was born of desperation and the single-minded focus of a man who could fix any engine and refuse to let the socialist state fix his future. The nozzles, the gas tanks, they weren't for speed. They were for height. He wasn't planning to drive through the border defenses. He was going to try to fly over them. Klaus Richter raised his rifle. All right, was, Muller. That's enough theater. He's preparing to move. On my command, we fire warning shots. Don't hit the car, just the ground in front of it. Make him stop. The man in the car, Hans, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He flipped a series of 3 heavy, unmarked toggle switches on his custom-made control panel. A loud hiss of compressed gas filled the cabin, and the Wartburg's small frame visibly shuddered. The engine noise dropped slightly, choked by the sudden diversion of power and pressure. Then, from the 2 crudely welded nozzles on the back bumper, a sheet of violent, dark orange flame erupted. It wasn't a powerful, controlled jet. It was a terrifying, uncontrolled blast of pure, raw thrust. A loud, continuous whoosh ripped the morning silence apart. The smell of burning acetylene and gasoline vapor hit the soldiers like a physical wave. The little Wartburg 311 didn't spin its tires. It didn't try to drive forward. It simply lurched, its rear end momentarily dipping. And then, with the force of the combined rockets firing straight backward and slightly downward, the entire car jumped. It didn't jump high, maybe a meter and a half off the ground. But it was enough. The car sailed, a terrifying, flaming projectile, completely clearing the first strand of razor wire and the low, wooden border barrier, heading straight for the second, taller fence. Klaus Richter stood frozen, his mouth agape. The initial wave of contempt had been replaced by a shock that stole his voice and his training. Fire! Fire now! He finally screamed, bringing his rifle up, the sound of his voice cracking with disbelief as the smoking, sputtering miracle car sailed over the sacred, inviolable border. The sound of the Kalashnikovs joining the roar of the homemade jet nozzles was deafening, tearing a violent hole in the pre-dawn quiet. Sergeant Richter emptied a short, controlled burst of 7.62 millimeters rounds, aiming at the car's tires, or perhaps just at the car. Corporal Voss and Private Muller followed suit, their panic-driven fire less disciplined, chewing up the mud and splattering the raked earth of the death strip just behind the bounding car. The bullets struck the metal with dull, insignificant thwacks, their kinetic energy easily absorbed by the thick, boxy frame and the hastily installed steel plate covering the back window. The men were aiming at a moving target that wasn't moving like a car. It was moving like a poorly thrown, flaming boulder. Inside the Wartburg, the world was a cacophony of shrieking metal and the dizzying smell of burnt propellant. Hans Strelczyk didn't hear the bullets. He only heard the immense, terrifying whoosh inches behind his head. He was leaning forward, gripping the wheel, his entire focus narrowed down to the single, desperate objective: maintain the trajectory. The blast of the acetylene-boosted engines was momentary, designed not for sustained flight, but for a single, powerful push. He had calculated the precise burn time, 3 terrifying seconds, to clear the first 2 obstacles before the pressure dropped and the car slammed back down to earth. The car's jump was jarring. The suspension screamed a metallic protest as it absorbed the initial recoil, lifting the car clear, but the landing was going to be a gut punch. Hans felt the pressure of the thrust physically compress his chest, a desperate, exhilarating shove toward freedom. His wife, Ingrid, clung to their children, bundled tightly in the back, biting down on her own arm to suppress a cry as the car became an airborne projectile. The car slammed down with crushing force. Crunch! The front suspension buckled, the tires squealed on the wet grass, and the momentum propelled it forward another crucial 10 meters. Hans fought the steering wheel, correcting the violent skid, his eyes fixed on the next barrier. The primary, 3-meter-high metal mesh fence topped with razor wire coils, the centerpiece of the border. He had landed squarely in the second part of the Sperrgebiet, the zone between the two fences. He didn't slow down. He couldn't. The second burst. Richter yelled, frantically adjusting the magazine on his rifle. Aim for the engine block. The front. Stop that thing. The NVA soldiers, their training finally kicking back in, shifted their aim to the front of the car, trying to disable the engine and stop the forward momentum. Richter knew that if the car cleared the second fence, it was effectively over. Even if it was disabled in the third zone, the last 5 meters leading up to the actual boundary line, it would be a politically disastrous incident. A successful escape by air, however brief, was an unacceptable propaganda loss for the German Democratic Republic, GDR. Hans reached for the second set of toggle switches, mounted just below the first set. This was the critical phase, the one he had practiced in his dreams, the one that depended on precision, timing, and a miracle. The Wartbike, having lost most of its initial jump height, was now rolling at maybe 40 kilometers per hour, about 25 miles per hour, toward the daunting wall of steel mesh. Hans pushed the throttle all the way down, forcing the little engine to its limit, and simultaneously, crack, he engaged the second propellant stage. This time, the nozzles hissed, then roared with a thicker, darker flame. The pressure was higher, the boost more intense. The combined chemicals erupted in a blast that was louder and more sustained than the first. The car's body groaned, lifting again, just as it struck the base of the metal fence. Instead of crashing into the wire mesh and rolling, which was the expected and planned for result by the border security, the car's front wheels hit the very base of the fence, momentarily slowing it, but the upward thrust from the rockets, firing continuously for a full 2 seconds, pushed the nose up against the rigid steel structure. It was a bizarre, uncontrolled mechanical climb. The car was briefly vertical, balanced precariously on its nose against the fence. The wheels spun uselessly in the air, but the flaming nozzles provided the continuous, violent push. The height of the fence was exactly 3 meters. The small, squat Wartburg was only 1.45 meters tall. Hans needed to clear more than double the car's height. Sparks flew violently as the rear bumper, still firing its jets, scraped against the razor wire coils at the fence's summit. The metal shrieked against metal, an awful, grinding noise that mingled with the jets and the continuing rifle fire. The air was filled with the smell of scorched paint, burning propellant, and ozone. For a terrifying, endless moment, the car seemed to hang there, a flaming caricature pinned to the side of the border fence. Then, the weight of the engine, the forward momentum, and the continuous push of the jets worked together. The car tipped over the top. It didn't clear the fence gracefully. It didn't sail over. It tumbled end over end, once, twice, a catastrophic, chaotic roll down the other side, the West German side. The 3 NVA soldiers watched the smoking, flaming wreckage disappear over the summit and into the darkness beyond. The sound of the jet nozzles, which had been the focus of their terror, suddenly cut out. Only the receding clatter of the metal car rolling down an embankment remained. Klaus Richter lowered his rifle, the barrel smoking. He looked at the 2 young soldiers, their faces gray with shock and disbelief. Did they stop? Muller whispered, shaking. Richter didn't answer. He looked at the mangled 3-meter fence, the razor wire bent and twisted where the car had scraped over it. He looked at the clean, continuous tracks of the tires in the death strip, showing exactly where the car had driven and flown. He looked across the remaining, final 50 meters of open ground, which was West Germany. No, Muller, Richter said, his voice a hoarse whisper. They didn't stop. They didn't stop at all. He knew what he had to do next. He had to report the unbelievable. He had to tell his superiors that a common mechanic, using parts scavenged from junkyards in a car that soldiers had laughed at, had just defeated their state-of-the-art, multi-million mark border defenses. He had to report the successful air escape of the Strelczyk family. The silence on the western side of the border was instantaneous. broken only by the sporadic, wet thump of rolling metal and the faint, agonizing sound of the car's horn, stuck on full blast as the wreckage finally settled. The Wartburg 311, now a crumpled, smoking mess of steel and broken glass, lay upside down in a shallow, muddy drainage ditch about 20 meters past the final, symbolic white boundary marker. The ditch, a natural depression meant to catch rainwater, proved to be a final, unintended stroke of luck. It cushioned the final, catastrophic roll. For a moment, nothing moved. The horn blared, a lonely, desperate sound that seemed to mock the entire apparatus of the German Democratic Republic. Hans Strelczyk, hanging upside down in the ruined driver's seat, felt the sickening rush of blood to his head. The seat belt, a luxury he had insisted on installing despite its rarity in an East German car, had saved his life. He pushed against the crushed roof, fighting against gravity and the terrible, disorienting shock. His head was ringing, but his thoughts were crystal clear. We are across. We are across. He fumbled for the release latch. The door, or what was left of it, was jammed solid. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the adrenaline. He reached back toward the rear cabin, toward Ingrid and the children. Ingrid, Ingrid, answer me. Are you hurt? He yelled, his voice raw. Hans, I'm here. The children, they're crying, but they're still moving. His wife's voice came back, muffled but firm. She sounded like she was buried under an avalanche of blankets and metal debris. Get us out, Hans. Please, the smoke. The jet fuel, or what was left of the proprietary chemical mix he'd used, was smoking violently, mingling with leaking gasoline from the punctured tank. The risk of explosion was terrifyingly real. Using the small emergency fire axe he had stowed under the dash, intended for cutting through wires, not car bodies, Hans furiously attacked the twisted door frame. The metal was thick and unforgiving, but his desperation lent him superhuman strength. He managed to pry the frame back just enough to slip out, tumbling onto the muddy bank. He scrambled to the rear of the car, where the metal plate covering the back window was now partially torn away. He reached in, his hands tearing on the jagged edges of the metal, pulling away the blankets and shielding his wife and two young children. Karen, their eldest, a girl of 8, was terrified but physically unharmed. Klaus, the 4-year-old, was crying inconsolably, his face streaked with dirt and fear, clutching a worn, stuffed animal. Ingrid emerged last, her face pale, a deep gash bleeding heavily on her forearm where she had braced against the violent final impact, but she was whole. Hans didn't look back at the border. He didn't look at the watchtower, or the fence, or the flashlights now bobbing in panic on the East German side. All that mattered was the ground beneath his feet, West German soil. He scooped up his son and started running, pulling Ingrid and Karen with him toward the nearest stand of trees. On the eastern side, Sergeant Richter was already on the field phone, barking into the receiver. Headquarters, this is Sector Alpha 2. We have an immediate border penetration. Repeat, a successful escape. Vehicle, Wartburg 311, heavily modified with thrust devices. They cleared the second barrier, the main fence. They are now on Bundesrepublik territory. Require immediate reinforcement and assessment. Richter slammed the phone down, his mind still grappling with the sheer audacity of the mechanic's plan. The laughter they had shared only minutes ago about the rocket car now felt like a curse. His career, he knew, was over. The Stasi, the secret police, would descend like a plague. This wasn't just an escape. It was a devastating humiliation. He ordered Voss and Mahler to secure the penetration point, emphasizing with extreme menace that no one was to cross the borderline. Meanwhile, Hans and his family collapsed, exhausted, into the wet undergrowth of the West German forest, about 100 meters from the wreckage. They huddled together, listening to the desperate, fading sound of the car horn. It was Ingrid who first noticed the figure approaching them. A tall man in a dark green uniform, carrying an FN FAL assault rifle, was walking toward them, slowly, cautiously, from the deeper shadows of the woods. Hans pushed his family behind him, every muscle tensing for a fight he couldn't win. He was covered in soot, oil, and blood. He couldn't speak, could only gasp for breath. The man stopped about 5 meters away. His uniform was different, his rifle different. He wasn't a communist soldier. He was a Bundesgrenzschutz, BGS, officer, a West German border guard. The BGS officer looked at the Strelczyk family, the crying children, the bloodied mother, the soot-covered father, then past them toward the smoking wreck and the towering fence. He lowered his weapon and spoke, his voice calm, heavy with a regional West German accent. "Guten Morgen. You came from that?" he asked, pointing a thumb at the still blaring horn and the mangled car. Hans could only nod, tears finally stinging his eyes, mixing with the soot on his cheeks. The officer smiled, a genuine, warm expression that erased the cold, official mask. "Well, Herr Strelczyk, welcome to the West. I think you just made a bit of a spectacular arrival." He immediately radioed his post, requesting emergency medical aid and, more importantly, protection. The border was a tinderbox. A successful, violent escape like this, one that required heavy engineering, carried the acute risk of a hot pursuit by frustrated NVA or Stasi units, a breach of the border in return. Hans, finally safe, sank to his knees in the mud, hugging his children close as the blare of the car horn finally died, a final, silent moment of victory. The East had lost one family, but they had gained a powerful, terrifying legend. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting a weak, cold light over the border zone, but the tranquility was utterly shattered. Within minutes of Sergeant Richter's frantic report, the area on the East German side transformed into a hive of frantic, uniformed activity. The first arrivals were not the local NVA command, but a detachment of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, MFS, the Stasi. They arrived in a convoy of dark, unmarked Wartburg 353 sedans and heavy military trucks, their faces grim and radiating a furious, controlled panic. Leading the delegation was Major Gerhard Rees, a man whose entire career was built on the seamless, unbreachable integrity of the inner German border. Rees was tall, gaunt, and possessed an aura of terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. He stepped out of his car and immediately surveyed the scene. The twisted, 3-meter fence ripped open at the top, the tracks of the jet-powered vehicle leading straight through the sacred Todesstreifen, death strip, and the visible plume of smoke still rising from the wreckage across the line. He didn't need a briefing. The scene screamed failure. Major Rees approached Sergeant Richter, who stood rigidly at attention, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos. Rees didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. That was worse. His voice was a low, chilling hiss. "Sergeant Richter," Rees began, his eyes fixed on the man, not the scene. "Explain to me. Explain how a car, a common, civilian Wartburg, managed to fly over a barrier that was designed to repel tanks." Richter swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Major, the vehicle was heavily modified. It had what appeared to be. I don't care what it appeared to be. I care about the fact of the matter," Rees interrupted, his voice finally tightening with venom. "The fact is a family of 4 known traitors used an amateur, half-baked machine to mock the sovereignty of the German Democratic Republic. This is not merely an escape, Sergeant. This is an act of political sabotage on a colossal scale. Every Western newspaper will run this story. We will be laughed at. You will be laughed at." Rees turned away abruptly, addressing his Stasi team leader. "I want the penetration point secured immediately. Double the wire. Triple it. Bring in the engineers. This section of fence must be completely replaced within 48 hours. I want the ground scoured for any trace of the escapee's design, any scrap metal, any wiring, anything that suggests how this was achieved. No residue is to remain." The priority shifted instantly from apprehension to absolute cover-up and intelligence gathering. The Stasi's primary goal was to prevent the method of the escape from becoming public knowledge on the eastern side, fearing a mass wave of copycat attempts. The story that would be leaked internally would be a sanitized version, a failed attempt, foiled by heroic NVA forces, with the individuals involved apprehended or stopped. While Stasi technicians in white overalls meticulously scanned the dirt for forensic evidence, Richter was led away for immediate, intense interrogation. The major wanted to know everything about Hans Strelczyk, his job, his contacts, his political history, his favorite toothpaste. Had he shown any prior mechanical eccentricity? Had he bought an unusual amount of industrial gas? Who helped him? The interrogation was brutal, focusing not on what Richter saw, but on what he failed to prevent. Richter insisted the vehicle was unremarkable until the point of ignition. He described the crude, almost farcical appearance of the jet nozzles. He described the laughter. Major Reese listened to the tape recording of the interview later that day, sitting in a temporary command post set up in a dusty local police station. He stopped the tape at the word laughed. They laughed. Reese murmured to his adjutant, Captain Lehman. The border troops laughed at the device that breached the border. That tells you everything, Lehman. That is the hubris of socialism. Underestimation of the enemy's desperation. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. The Western media will call him a genius. A folk hero. We cannot allow that. Find every relative, every friend, every work colleague of Hans Strelczyk still in the GDR. Begin Operation Wartburg. We will make his life on the other side a living hell, and we will ensure that his legend dies a quick, quiet death here. Operation Wartburg was immediately launched, a systematic effort to locate, harass, and intimidate everyone Strelczyk had ever known. His former neighbors would be subjected to educational talks about the dangers of Republic fleeing the Republic. His name would be purged from official records. The physical remnant, the wreckage, was a different problem. The car, visible just a few meters beyond the line, was an unmovable, flaming monument to the failure of the communist state. They could not touch it, but they couldn't ignore it. Reese ordered a propaganda truck with a powerful loudspeaker system to park immediately adjacent to the penetration site on the East German side. The speakers began to broadcast a continuous loop of loud, tinny, patriotic marching music, a crude attempt to drown out the sight and sound of the lingering wreckage and mask the silence that had fallen over the West German side. On the West German side, the immediate aftermath of the crash landing was chaotic but celebratory. Hans Strelczyk and his family were swiftly escorted by the Bundesgrenzschutz, BGS, to a nearby police station in the small border town of Duderstadt. Doctors were called to treat Ingrid's arm and check the children, while intelligence officers from the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, began the crucial process of debriefing Hans. The details of the escape were simply too spectacular, too unbelievable to keep secret. Within the hour, the story was leaking, not through official channels, but through the excited chatter of the local BGS units who had witnessed the flaming wreckage and met the soot-covered family. A mechanic had turned a tiny, clunky East German sedan into a rudimentary rocket, successfully jumping the Iron Curtain. By mid-morning, the international press descended on Duderstadt. Reporters from the Associated Press, Reuters, and major German, British, and American newspapers flooded the small town. They wanted interviews, photographs, and most importantly, access to the vehicle. The mangled Wartburg, still lying on its side in the muddy ditch, became an instant symbol of resistance, a testament to human ingenuity against totalitarian oppression. The West German government, particularly the Ministry for All German Affairs, immediately grasped the immense propaganda value of Hans Strelczyk's feat. This wasn't a drab, secret escape. This was a spectacle, an engineering triumph that exposed the East German border defenses as vulnerable and laughably inadequate. A press conference was hastily organized. Hans, cleaned up but clearly exhausted, stood before a wall of clicking cameras and flashing bulbs. He spoke simply, without political rhetoric, focused only on the crushing desperation that had driven him. "I only wanted a better life for my children," he told the reporters, his voice steady despite the overwhelming attention. They were building the wall higher, making the mines closer. I knew the only way left was over. And a mechanic, he can always figure out how to improve a machine, even a bad one. When asked about the design, Hans explained the physics with the matter-of-fact confidence of a skilled tradesman. He hadn't used military-grade rocket fuel. He had used a carefully calculated mix of readily available industrial gases, acetylene and oxygen, highly pressurized, and mixed it with gasoline vapor in his crude nozzles to create an explosive, if brief, upward thrust. The tanks had been acquired piece by piece from various factory scrap piles, his intentions always hidden under the guise of an experimental welding project. The press ate it up. Headlines screamed across Europe. The rocket car mechanic blasts to freedom, and Wartburg jumps the wall. Engineering defeats tyranny. Hans Strelczyk was instantly transformed from a provincial mechanic into a global anti-communist folk hero. Meanwhile, back at the border, a large crowd of West German citizens, journalists, and curious onlookers gathered near the ditch, peering over the final boundary marker at the wreckage. They cheered when the BGS placed a small West German flag near the car. The noise was so significant that the Stasi's pathetic attempts to drown it out with marching music were completely ineffective. Major Reese, listening from the east, was apoplectic. The sheer public spectacle on the other side was turning a security breach into a global media event. He had his men take photographs of the press gathering, evidence of the West's hostile provocation against the GDR. The West German intelligence services decided on a crucial next step: preserving the escape vehicle. It was a tangible piece of evidence, a Cold War artifact of staggering importance. Under the direct supervision of BGS commanders, a heavy-duty salvage truck was brought in. The operation was painstaking. Every move was watched by binoculars from the east. The salvage crew used specialized rigging to gently lift the mangled, smoking Wartburg out of the ditch and onto a flatbed trailer. As the wreck was towed away, one of the BGS officers held up a handwritten sign for the NVA observers to see: "Your loss. Our museum piece." This act cemented the humiliation. The escape was now immortalized, not just in headlines, but in a physical object preserved for posterity. Hans Strelczyk, now in a clean shirt and a state of bewildered exhaustion, was offered asylum and immediate relocation assistance. He had lost everything: his home, his workshop, his life savings, but he had gained freedom and a future for his children. He never regretted the terror of the final moments. The roar of his homemade jets was the sound of his rebirth. Hans Strelczyk's escape vehicle, quickly dubbed the Flying Wartburg by the international press, was far more than just a car with pipes welded to the bumper. It was a masterwork of clandestine mechanical engineering, born from years of training and months of intense, secretive labor. The true marvel wasn't the flight itself, but the meticulous preparation and precision required to execute a plan dependent on physics and chance. The car was a 1957 Wartburg 311 sedan, a ubiquitous model in the GDR, making it ideal for camouflage. Hans had purchased it specifically because its simple, robust chassis could withstand the kind of structural abuse he planned to inflict upon it. He stripped the interior down to the metal, removing everything non-essential: the back seats, the upholstery, the headliner. The weight reduction was critical. Every kilogram saved men a fraction of a meter more in jump height. The core of the system was the thrust assembly. Hans had scavenged 2 large industrial-grade steel cylinders, one for highly compressed acetylene, the other for oxygen. He obtained them separately, months apart, claiming they were for legitimate welding jobs, and hid them in the false wall of his shed. The combination of these 2 gases, when ignited under pressure, created a reaction far more violent and powerful than pure combustion engine exhaust. The jet nozzles were, as Sergeant Richter had observed, little more than thick, custom-cut steel funnels, expertly welded to a reinforced crossbeam bolted to the rear bumper mounts. They were canted at a specific, upward-pointing angle, about 15 degrees, designed to maximize the vertical lift component while still ensuring enough horizontal thrust to carry the car forward over the obstacle. The real genius lay in the injection system. This was the part that baffled the Stasi engineers when they later received leaked reports of the car's design. Hans didn't simply open a valve. He built a miniature, pressurized mixing chamber where the acetylene and oxygen were combined with atomized gasoline vapor drawn directly from the car's fuel line. This chemical cocktail was then routed through reinforced hoses to the two nozzles. The control panel in the cockpit, the series of toggle switches, governed the two critical phases of the escape. Phase 1, the blast. This switch activated the primary, high-pressure burst, designed to ignite the mix and provide the single, explosive jump needed to clear the first barrier and the death strip. This firing lasted exactly 3 seconds. Phase 2, the boost. This switch, activated after the car landed and was accelerating toward the main fence, engaged a slightly lower pressure, more sustained burn, lasting 5 seconds. This was the climbing thrust, meant to push the car against the fence and up rather than over it. The entire apparatus was volatile, dangerous, and completely unstable. A leak, a spark, or an overpressure situation would have turned the Wartburg into a four-wheel bomb. The safety feature, a crudely installed release valve, was merely a gesture. Hans understood the risk perfectly. The moment he flipped those switches, he was committing to a suicide ride, but it was a ride toward the only possible future. When the BGS engineers inspected the wreck, they marveled at the sheer audacity and mechanical skill. The high-heat exhaust from the nozzles had completely melted the rear bumper and scorched the paint, but the structural welds had held. The pressure gauges, which had reached near-critical levels, were frozen at their maximum readings. Hans had, in effect, created a homemade, single-use, solid-fuel rocket-assisted takeoff, RADO system for an automobile, all constructed using repurposed scrap and black market gas. It was a tangible rebuttal to the GDR's claim of technological superiority and a chilling demonstration of what desperation could drive a clever man to achieve. The detailed design of the Flug Wartburg was not just a historical curiosity, it was a manual. The Western intelligence agencies meticulously documented every component, not to replicate it, but to understand the methodology, realizing that the principle of the boosted jump could potentially inspire other, more refined attempts. The story wasn't just about Hans Strelczyk, it was a roadmap for defying the Iron Curtain's physical boundaries. The knowledge, they knew, could not be confined to a museum. It would, inevitably, travel back east. The successful flight of the Flug Wartburg was, as Major Reese had feared, the spark that ignited a new phase in the battle of wits along the inner German border. The story, relayed via West German radio and smuggled newspapers, quickly circulated among the most desperate and inventive citizens of the GDR. The message was clear. The wall was not impenetrable. It simply required more ingenuity than the East German state expected. Within months, the Stasi began documenting a noticeable shift in the type of escape attempts. The crude attempts, the simple fence climbs, the reckless swims, were being replaced by complex, motorized or engineered endeavors. This marked the beginning of an unofficial, deadly arms race of escape between the citizens and the state. The most immediate and direct copycat was the boosted tractor. Inspired by Strelczyk's use of explosive thrust, a group of farmers near Salzwedel attempted to modify a heavy agricultural tractor, a Fortschritt ZT300, by attaching a similar, though far larger, set of pressurized fuel tanks. Their plan was to use the tractor's sheer weight and power, combined with a jet assist, to simply smash through the light vehicle barriers and then jump the main fence. This attempt, however, ended in disaster. The farmer's welding was subpar, and the sheer volume of propellant needed to move a machine several times the weight of the Wartburg proved unstable. The tractor detonated prematurely during the ignition sequence near the border, killing one of the men instantly and leaving the other two severely injured, to be immediately apprehended by the NVA patrol. Major Reese received this news with a grim satisfaction. The initial spectacular success was balanced by a horrifying, quiet failure, which served its own deterrent purpose. The inspiration wasn't limited to ground vehicles. Strelczyk's feat demonstrated the possibility of air travel, however brief. This led to the most famous follow-up attempts, hot air balloons. If a car could be boosted over the border, perhaps a homemade aircraft could glide over it entirely. Two families, the Strelczyks, no relation to Hans, and the Wetzel family spent 2 years secretly sewing and constructing a massive hot air balloon from scrap material, patchwork cotton, umbrella fabric, and thick bed sheets. In 1979, they successfully lifted off near Hof, sailing over the entire border apparatus and landing safely in Bavaria. Their success proved that Strelczyk's defiance was a template, not a fluke. Other escape methods that gained traction in the following years, all rooted in the idea of overcoming the border's height and density, included custom-built gliders, small, single-person gliders launched from high rooftops near the border, armored vehicles. Several successful escapes were achieved by people stealing and modifying large military trucks, using armor plating to drive straight through the thinner sections of the fence. Refined tunnels. Tunneling efforts became more sophisticated, utilizing ventilation systems and rail carts to remove the massive amounts of dirt, a direct response to the border's increased density. The Stasi's response to this wave of engineering was continuous, reactive fortification. The Floodwartburg taught them that vertical defenses were a primary weakness. They immediately began installing a series of angled steel girders, known as Spanish riders, in the death strip, designed to snag and flip any vehicle attempting a jump or a high-speed breach. They raised the height of the main metal mesh fence from 3 meters to 3.4 meters in many sections, adding more sophisticated electronic warning systems and tripwires. The focus of the NVA border troops shifted from merely watching for climbers to anticipating mechanical threats. Every unusual vehicle, every large component, every industrial gas tank purchased in the border regions came under intense scrutiny. Major Reese found himself overseeing a new intelligence unit dedicated solely to tracking unusual mechanical and chemical purchases within the Sperrgebiet. Hans Strelczyk, now safely established in West Germany, watched the news of the copycat attempts with a mix of pride and dread. He knew his method was a symbol, but it was also a risk. His success, achieved with luck and extreme precision, had paved the way for others who might not be so fortunate. The Cold War along the border had irrevocably changed. It was now a war fought not just with bullets and wire, but with blueprints, scrap metal, and the explosive power of desperate human invention. For Hans Strelczyk, the sudden, brilliant flash of fame was a double-edged sword. He was instantly wealthy by the standards of an East German mechanic, with generous grants and donations pouring in from West German citizens and organizations eager to support a hero of freedom. He quickly secured a comfortable apartment for his family and found work immediately in a well-equipped West German garage, his mechanical genius finally appreciated and rewarded. However, his high profile came at a severe cost. He became an immediate and permanent target for the Stasi. Major Reese's Operation Wartburg was not a fleeting moment of bureaucratic anger. It was a long-term strategy of psychological warfare. The Stasi's goal was to neutralize the propaganda effect of Strelczyk's escape by turning his life in the West into a cautionary tale of failure and despair. First, the Stasi attempted to recruit agents within his immediate circle in West Germany. They approached individuals arriving from the East, offering them better conditions in exchange for information on Strelczyk's activities, his mental state, and his political views. They wanted to know if the hero was drinking heavily, struggling with debt, or secretly regretting his decision. Any detail that could be used to discredit him in the West and sow doubt in the East. Second, they launched a sophisticated disinformation campaign. Articles were planted in controlled, foreign-language newspapers claiming that Strelczyk had fallen into ruin, that his family was ill, and that he missed the security and camaraderie of the socialist state. These articles, often grossly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, were intended to be intercepted and read by desperate citizens still trapped in the East. The message was, freedom comes at too high a price. Hans was constantly aware of the surveillance. The West German intelligence services debriefed him on the Stasi's likely tactics, but living under that shadow was a psychological strain. Every new acquaintance could be an agent, every unexpected phone call a probe. He moved house several times in the initial years, seeking anonymity, but his face and story were too recognizable. His greatest fear, however, was for the relatives he had left behind in the GDR. The Stasi systematically targeted them. His brother, a schoolteacher, was demoted and denied promotion, his application to university permanently rejected. His aging mother was frequently visited by Stasi officers for routine inquiries, thinly veiled intimidation sessions designed to pressure her to publicly denounce her son. The public denunciation never came, but the pressure worked. His family in the East was effectively placed under house arrest, ostracized by neighbors fearful of association, and constantly monitored. Hans tried to send them money, but the Stasi intercepted the currency, seizing it as damages owed to the state for the destruction of state property, the border fence. The success of the Flugwartburg also created a security nightmare for West German border authorities. The BGS had to deal with the inevitable stream of journalists and tourists who wanted to get close to the site of the famous jump. This constant stream of traffic caused tensions with the NVA troops, leading to frequent minor incidents, shouting matches across the line, and the occasional exchange of warning flares. The Strelczyk crossing became a new, highly volatile flashpoint on the border map. Hans realized that his act of personal liberation had made him a commodity in the Cold War, a living tool of Western propaganda, and a permanent nemesis of the East German state. The roar of the jet nozzles had purchased freedom, but the noise of his fame had banished peace. He eventually stepped back from the media spotlight, focusing on his family and his work, hoping that by disappearing into the anonymity of the West, he could lessen the Stasi's focus on him and, more importantly, on the loved ones he could not save. The political ramifications of the Flugwartburg incident extended far beyond the immediate border zone and the Strelczyk family. In the highest echelons of the Politburo in East Berlin, the escape was treated not as a security failure, but as a severe blow to the party's morale and the credibility of the state's control. The success of a single, ingenious mechanic seemed to invalidate the entire doctrine of deterrence upon which the border was built. General Erich Honecker, then the powerful Central Committee Secretary for Security Affairs, personally ordered an immediate top-to-bottom review of the entire border system. This review, driven by fury and political fear, resulted in a significant escalation of border security known internally as the third-generation fortifications. The objective was simple: make the border so complex, so lethal, and so psychologically daunting that the cost of an attempt would far outweigh any perceived benefit of freedom. Key changes directly influenced by Strelczyk's jump included vertical obstacle hardening. As noted earlier, the main fence was reinforced and, in many places, replaced with a heavier, more rigid mesh. Anti-vehicle obstacles like the Spanish riders were standardized along the entire length of the border to counter any repeat of the boosted car or armored truck method. The enhanced death strip. The Todesstreifen was widened in flatter areas and meticulously cleared of any cover. More sophisticated sensor systems, including tripwires and directional acoustic sensors, were buried beneath the soil to detect any digging or heavy vehicular approach before it reached the main barriers. The Schießbefehl, order to shoot, while officially a long-standing policy, the Schießbefehl was emphasized and enforced with renewed ruthlessness. The primary role of the Grenztruppen, border troops, was reasserted: prevent border breaches by any means, including the immediate use of deadly force. The political education of the troops was intensified, hammering home the doctrine that the Republik fleeing individuals, were dangerous criminals and enemies of the state. Crucially, the psychological war intensified. The East German state could not prevent the story of Strelczyk's brilliance from leaking, so they tried to counteract it with a campaign of absolute terror. Patrols became more visible, less tolerant, and executed their duties with brutal efficiency. The soldiers knew that a successful escape in their sector would mean the immediate end of their careers, intense interrogation by the Stasi, and possible imprisonment. This intense pressure was designed to make the soldiers more trigger-happy, increasing the likelihood of a fatal shooting during an attempt, which in turn served as the ultimate deterrent. Major Rees, who had been heavily reprimanded but retained his post due to his deep knowledge of the matter, shifted his focus from the how of the escape to the why. He became obsessed with preventing the development of a culture of escape. He mandated the infiltration of East German amateur mechanical and flying clubs, placing spies to report on any unusual interest in engines, high-pressure gas, or light aviation materials. The Stasi's analysts concluded that the border wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. Strelczyk's successful jump had broken the psychological barrier, showing that the impossible could be achieved. Their mission now was to rebuild that mental wall, higher and thicker than the physical one. They aimed to instill total hopelessness in the population regarding escape, ensuring that the thought of breaching the border was instantly paired with the certainty of violent death. The cost of freedom was raised to the price of a life. The wreckage of Hans Strelczyk's Wartburg 311, the Flood Wartburg, was not merely discarded once the intelligence teams finished their inspection. It was recognized as a uniquely potent symbol, a piece of tangible history from the very moment of its creation. The car was cleaned, preserved, and eventually put on permanent display in West Berlin at the House and Checkpoint Charlie Museum, a repository dedicated to documenting the history of the Berlin Wall and the successful and tragic attempts to cross it. In the museum, the car was given a second, symbolic life. It stood, crushed and scorched, its amateur jet nozzles a stark, visceral reminder of the Cold War's human cost and ingenious defiance. It was exhibited next to other artifacts of escape, homemade hot air balloons, tiny submersibles, and complex tunneling equipment. Yet, the Wartburg drew the most attention, embodying the universal story of the common man triumphing over an oppressive state with nothing but wit and scrap metal. The museum placard detailed the full story: the mechanic's desperation, the year of secret labor, the laughter of the East German border guards, and the final, flaming jump to freedom. For millions of Western visitors, the car was a simple, powerful lesson in the moral difference between the two German states, one that built walls and one that celebrated the freedom to design a rocket car to fly over them. This public display was yet another source of fury for Major Reese and the Stasi. They could not suppress the legend. They could only watch as their monumental failure was packaged and presented as a heroic narrative. The mere existence of the Flood Wartburg in a West Berlin museum served as a continuous, silent piece of Western propaganda, its twisted metal frame whispering the word Republic flushed to anyone who saw it. For Hans Strelczyk, the car's museum presence was a source of mixed feelings. He visited it rarely. Seeing the wreck brought back the immediate, visceral terror of the crash, the smell of burning fuel, and the silent fear of his children. It was a monument to his lowest point, the moment of such crushing desperation that he gambled his family's lives on a homemade bomb, but also the zenith of his courage. The car's fame also prompted commercial interest. Years later, a West German production company approached Hans with the idea of making a feature film about his escape. Hans was hesitant, wary of exploiting his trauma, but eventually agreed, realizing that the story needed to be permanently recorded, not just for his children, but for history. He insisted on accuracy, ensuring that the film portrayed the true, crude, and terrifying reality of the escape, not some Hollywoodized action sequence. The story was also meticulously researched and documented by historians, becoming a staple example in studies of Cold War escape technology and civil resistance. The car proved that innovation, often born of necessity, could evolve faster than state bureaucracy could build defenses. For the East German government, the Flood Wartburg was a ghost they could never exorcise, a persistent, physical reminder that every wall has a weakness, and every regulation can be subverted by a clever mechanic with a profound desire for freedom. The car's mangled shell became an enduring symbol, a piece of kinetic art created by the forces of hope and oppression. Hans Strelczyk's escape was a decisive moment in his life, but for his wife, Ingrid, and their children, Karen and Klaus, it was the tumultuous beginning of their new existence. Adjusting to life in the West, the sudden affluence, the chaotic freedom, and the persistent media attention was a profound challenge, especially after the cloistered, controlled environment of the GDR. Ingrid Strelczyk, a woman defined by her quiet strength and unwavering support of her husband's insane plan, struggled with the psychological residue of the escape. She was hailed as the brave mother who drugged her children to ensure their silence during the terrifying jump, an action that demonstrated both incredible love and immense desperation. Yet, she carried the heavy burden of that memory. The sudden sounds of a jet engine, even years later, could trigger a sharp, cold panic, instantly transporting her back to the violent, fiery moments inside the tumbling car. She found solace in anonymity, focusing entirely on providing a stable, normal upbringing for her children, far from the cameras. For Karen and Klaus, the children, the escape story was both a badge of honor and a haunting childhood memory. Klaus, the youngest, had only fleeting, visceral memories. The dark, suffocating space under the blankets, the smell of burnt chemicals, and the loud, terrifying roar that preceded the violent crash. These fragmented sensations, however, formed the foundation of his earliest understanding of freedom, a chaotic, loud, and deeply physical act. Karen, slightly older, was more aware of the geopolitical significance. She understood that her father was a hero, but she also understood the cost. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes, and she learned early on about the Stasi's continuous attempts to contact or discredit her father. She had to navigate the strange cultural divide between the East German childhood they left behind, marked by austerity and political dogma, and the consumerist, open society of the West. Their parents' single, heroic action meant they could never truly be anonymous. They were forever the Wartburg children. Hans, despite the financial stability and professional success he achieved in his new West German garage, remained preoccupied with the family and friends still trapped in the East. He utilized the connections and funding he gained from his fame to become an advocate for other escapees and a donor to organizations that specialized in freeing political prisoners. He channeled his engineering skills into less volatile endeavors, restoring classic cars and teaching young apprentices, finding a quiet, fulfilling routine that helped to dim the glare of his celebrity. He maintained secret contact with his family in the GDR through trusted intermediaries, constantly feeding them hope and assurance, knowing that every letter, every gesture of support was an act of defiance against Major Reese's mandate of psychological annihilation. The family's eventual peace was hard-won. They were survivors who had paid an enormous psychological price for their physical freedom. Hans Strelczyk's legacy wasn't just the wrecked car in the museum. It was the two well-adjusted children growing up in a democratic society, a reality that the GDR had tried with every technological and political weapon at its disposal to prevent. The simple fact that they existed, safe and free, was the most profound and enduring victory over the machinery of the Iron Curtain. They learned to live with the paradox of their fame, that the most terrifying moment of their lives was also the moment that secured their future, and that the mechanic's folly, the car the guard had laughed at, had ultimately given them everything. The escape of Hans Strelczyk and his family in 1963 was a spectacular moment, a blazing flare fired over the Iron Curtain. Yet, it was just one battle in a Cold War that would grind on for another 26 years. Through those decades, the Strelczyks lived in freedom, while Major Reese and the apparatus of the Stasi labored relentlessly to reinforce the border and extinguish the hope their escape had kindled. Then came 1989, a wave of peaceful protest fueled by economic stagnation and a sudden, desperate mass exodus via Hungary and Czechoslovakia, finally eroded the seemingly impregnable system of the German Democratic Republic. The political climate, shifting with impossible speed, reached its inevitable climax. On November 9, 1989, Hans Strelczyk was watching television with his family in their quiet West German home. He saw the unbelievable images, the confused border guard announcing, almost by accident, the opening of the Berlin Wall, and the immediate joyous surge of East German citizens pouring across the checkpoints, met by cheering West Germans. The moment was overwhelming. The wall that had been the singular, deadly focus of his life, The obstacle he had nearly died trying to fly over was now meaningless. The decades of fear, the psychological war waged by the Stasi, the constant worry for his relatives, it was all suddenly over. Hans immediately drove the short distance to the border crossing nearest his original escape point. The mood was electric. He stood there, not as the famous rocket car mechanic, but as a silent, emotional participant, watching the lines of old Trabants and Wartburgs, the same model he had modified, chugging past him into the west, their occupants weeping with relief. For Major Reese, the collapse was total, humiliating, and final. The very system he had sacrificed his humanity to protect evaporated overnight. The millions of marks spent on fortifications, the vast intelligence network, the decades of meticulous repression, all invalidated by a simple, bureaucratic blunder and the overwhelming desire of a free people. Reese, now a colonel in a defunct regime, found himself facing the opposite side of the Stasi's ledger: scrutiny, exposure, and, eventually, criminal investigation. With the opening of the archives in the early 1990s, Hans Strelczyk finally gained access to his Stasi file. It was a stack of paper nearly a meter high, detailing every aspect of Major Reese's Operation Wartburg. Hans read about the laughter of the guards, Richter's immediate interrogation, the detailed blueprints of his car stolen from internal reports, the relentless surveillance, and the systematic harassment of his mother and brother. Reading the official, cold language of the MFS reports was more chilling than the threat of bullets had been. It confirmed the scope of the state's obsessive focus on him. He saw the notes detailing the propaganda campaigns designed to ruin his reputation in the West, and the internal memos expressing fear that his escape would lead to further mechanical innovations. The file was the complete, documented history of the shadow that had stalked his family for 26 years. Hans Strelczyk did not seek revenge. He sought understanding and closure. He agreed to meet with historians and journalists, providing the final, crucial details of his planning and execution. He visited the Flugwartburg at the museum with his adult children, no longer viewing it with terror, but with a sense of historical detachment. The car was no longer a symbol of personal desperation, but a piece of evidence in a larger historical narrative of the Cold War. In the years following reunification, the border was dismantled. The main fence, the watchtowers, the anti-vehicle ditches, and the infamous Todesstreifen were all erased, reclaimed by nature. The spot where Hans Strelczyk's car had jumped and crashed was eventually marked by a simple memorial stone, placed by the local community. The story of the mechanic who used his talent to choose freedom became an essential element of the German historical consciousness, a reminder that in the conflict between the state's rigid dogma and the individual's creative spirit, the ingenuity of one man, even if initially laughed at, can ultimately change the course of history. The laughter of the border guards at the sight of the ridiculous, homemade rocket car was the sound of totalitarian certainty meeting its match in the human desire to be free.